Welcome back to another deep dive with us.
Yeah, welcome back.
You know how this works, learners. You give us a mountain of reading,
Mountain, yeah.
and we climb it for you.
We scale that mountain.
We conquer it.
Exactly.
And this time, learners, you have really outdone yourself.
You really have.
You've given us a treasure trove of information all about the Supreme Court of the United States.
The SCOTUS.
The SCOTUS.
Yeah, the big one.
Yeah. And to get to the bottom of all of this, to truly understand this behemoth of an institution, you've given us official government websites from the U.S. courts, from the White House archives, the Federal Judicial Center.
Wow.
And even some excerpts from the Constitution itself.
Really going back to the source.
Going right back to the source.
I like it.
So before we really get into the weeds here, what's our mission today with this deep dive? What are we really trying to understand about the Supreme Court?
Well, I think, it's easy to get lost in the complexities of the court.
Oh, absolutely.
But we want to keep it clear, keep it simple for the learners.
Yeah.
I think we're looking at the fundamental structure of the court. How is it built?
Yeah.
How does it work? What are the powers that it actually has?
Yeah.
How does it go about its business day to day?
Yeah.
And of course, most importantly, how does it fit into this beautiful system of checks and balances that the American government has?
Yeah, we hear that term all the time, checks and balances, checks and balances.
Right, but what does it actually mean in practice?
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court is such a vital part of that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I'm most excited to really get into today is how it interacts with the other branches of government.
Exactly.
Okay.
So where do we start?
Where do we start? Well, I think, like you said, we go right back to the source. We go right back to the Constitution.
The Constitution, our founding document.
Our founding document.
Yeah. And Article 3, Section 1, if I'm not mistaken.
You got it.
Really lays it all out there.
It does, and it's fascinating, because it states very clearly, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court.
Okay.
And in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish.
Okay, so right from the get-go, it's mandating one Supreme Court.
It's got to be there.
But then it gives Congress the power to create other courts.
That's right. So as they see fit.
It mandates that top tier, that court of last resort.
Yeah.
But it leaves it up to Congress to build out the rest of the system.
Right.
Which is interesting.
It is interesting.
And that's kind of the first clue into this idea of checks and balances.
Right there, right.
Bakes right in.
We've got this power dynamic already.
Yeah, so Congress has this power. Did they use it right away?
Yeah, they weren't messing around.
Oh, so just a year later, 1789, the Judiciary Act is passed.
Okay.
And this really puts the meat on the bones of Article 3.
Right.
So the Judiciary Act formally establishes the Supreme Court.
Okay.
It initially sets it up with a Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices.
6 total.
6 total.
Okay.
And this act also lays the groundwork for the entire lower federal court system as we know it today.
So all these district courts, all the circuit courts.
It's all stemming from this one piece of legislation.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing.
So, we talk about 1789, this very young nation still figuring things out.
Right.
When did the Supreme Court actually first meet, actually get down to business?
Well, so it was formally organized on February 2nd, 1790.
Okay.
It's, pretty quick.
Not bad.
Considering everything else that was going on.
Yeah.
But then it actually first met on February 1st, 1790 in New York City.
Oh, okay. So they got organized and then met right away the next day.
Yeah, no time to waste.
No time to waste, new nation.
New nation. Got to get going.
Okay, now, you mentioned 6 justices, and I know that number has changed over time.
It has.
What can you tell us about the number of justices on the Supreme Court?
Well, it's a bit of a moving target throughout history.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Congress has tweaked it multiple times.
Okay.
It's gone as low as 5, as high as 10.
Wow.
But since 1869, so shortly after the Civil War, it's been fixed at 9.
9.
1 Chief Justice, 8 Associate Justices.
Okay, so 9 since the end of the Civil War.
Yeah, and there are a lot of theories about why they settled on 9.
Oh, really?
One of the prevailing ones is that at the time, there were 9 judicial circuits.
Okay.
And it was thought that
Oh, to kind of match up.
neatly correspond.
Yeah. Okay, interesting.
So, each justice would have a sort of regional responsibility. But, whether that's the real reason or not, who knows?
Who knows? But it's 9.
It's 9 now.
It's 9 now, and it's been 9 for quite a while.
Yeah, and it seems pretty stable at this point.
Okay, so 9 justices,
Mhm.
and they have a rather unique position within the American government, right?
You do.
They're not elected officials. How are they chosen?
Well, they are appointed by the president.
Okay.
So the president nominates someone,
Uh,
and then that nomination has to be confirmed by the Senate.
okay, so both branches are involved?
Both branches are involved in this process.
Okay.
And once they're confirmed,
Mm-hmm.
they hold office for life.
For life, so long as they have good behavior.
Doing good behavior. Yeah, that's what the Constitution says.
The Constitution says.
So, it's not just a casual term.
Right.
It's there for a reason.
Yeah.
It's meant to ensure that the judiciary is independent.
Okay, I was going to say that sounds like a pretty key aspect of their independence. So, unlike elected officials who have to face, re-election every few years, these justices can make their decisions without the fear,
Right, without
being widowed out.
the pressure of the next election cycle,
Right.
of public opinion shifting.
Yeah.
They're supposed to be able to focus purely on
Yeah.
their interpretation of the law.
On the law and the facts of the case in front of them.
Precisely.
Okay. And there was one other thing about their compensation
Yes, that's right.
that also seems to be tied to this idea of independence.
Absolutely. Their salaries cannot be decreased during their term.
Wow.
And that's another safeguard against any kind of political pressure.
So if they rule against the president
Right.
or against Congress on something, the president can't just slash their pay.
Nope. They can't be retaliated against in that way.
Right.
So it's a really important protection.
Wow. Okay. So lifetime appointments,
Yeah.
guaranteed compensation, all in the name of ensuring that they can act independently.
It's all about protecting that judicial independence.
Okay. So we kind of understand who they are, how they get there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these 9 people are making massive decisions
Yes.
that have a huge impact on all of us.
They do.
So where does their authority to make these decisions come from?
Well, like everything with the Supreme Court, we have to go back to the Constitution.
Okay.
Article 3, Section 2 lays out the court's jurisdiction, which basically means what types of cases they're allowed to hear.
Okay, the scope of their authority.
Exactly.
Okay.
There are 2 main categories.
Okay.
Original jurisdiction and appellate jurisdiction.
Okay, so original jurisdiction, that means that certain cases go directly to the Supreme Court.
Right to the top.
You don't even have to
Straight to the Supreme Court.
mess around in lower court.
No messing around in the lower courts, that's right. Those are the VIP cases.
The VIP case, so
Yeah.
what kind of cases are we talking about?
Well, so the Constitution actually spells out a very specific and quite limited set of cases
Okay.
that fall under the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction.
Okay.
One big category is disputes between 2 or more states.
Okay, so if states are fighting over something,
Yeah, like water rights,
right,
state boundaries,
secure boundaries,
things like that.
Oh.
Those are pretty important.
yeah,
High stakes conflicts.
right. They affect lots of people,
They do.
potentially.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And then another category is cases involving ambassadors, public ministers, consuls.
Okay, so people representing the U.S. government abroad.
Exactly. Diplomats and foreign dignitaries.
Okay.
So, the framers, the people who wrote the Constitution,
Yeah.
they decided that these types of cases,
Yeah.
they were so important,
Okay.
so sensitive, that they needed to go straight to the top,
To the top.
to the highest court in the land.
Okay, interesting.
So that's original jurisdiction,
Right.
straight to the Supreme Court.
Right, to the top.
No detours.
Okay, so that's a very small number of cases, though.
Very small.
Right.
Tiny, tiny fraction of the overall workload.
Okay, so most cases that the Supreme Court hears come to them through what route?
Through appellate jurisdiction.
Appellate jurisdiction.
Which means, basically, they're hearing cases on appeal from lower courts.
Okay, so a case has already been decided by some other court, and then it's being appealed up to the Supreme Court.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction over cases that involve a question of federal law or a question of the Constitution. So this includes, for example, cases where the U.S. government is a party
Okay.
Cases involving treaties that the U.S. has signed and admiralty cases, which are basically cases about maritime law.
Ships in the sea.
Ships in the sea, exactly.
Okay, so pretty broad categories there.
Yeah, it covers a lot of ground.
Okay.
But the important thing to remember is that it's always tied to a question of federal law.
Okay.
Or the Constitution.
Okay, so it can't just be any old case.
Right, there has to be some federal element for it to reach the Supreme Court.
Okay, now theoretically, if any case that loses in a federal appeals court can appeal to the Supreme Court, wouldn't they be totally overwhelmed?
Oh, absolutely. They'd be drowning in cases.
Yeah.
So that's where the Certiorari Act of 1925 comes in.
Okay.
This act was a game changer.
Okay.
It gave the Supreme Court the power to choose which appellate cases they actually want to hear.
Okay, so they get to pick and choose?
They get to pick and choose.
Okay.
They're not obligated to hear every single appeal that comes their way.
Right. Okay, so I imagine they don't hear very many of the cases?
No, they do.
That are appealed to them?
They hear a tiny fraction.
A tiny fraction?
Of the cases.
Yeah, what kind of numbers are we talking about?
So each year, the court agrees to hear about 100 to 150 cases.
100 to 150?
Yeah.
Out of how many?
Out of, somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 new cases that are filed annually.
Wow.
So it's a really, really small percentage.
So they're really only choosing those cases that present some really groundbreaking or super important legal questions.
Yeah, they're looking for cases that will have a big impact on the law.
Yeah, so just to give our learners an idea of how that workload has increased over time.
It's ballooned.
Back in the 1950 term, they only received about 1,200 cases.
That's a light year compared to today.
Yeah, and by the 1975 term, that number had jumped to almost 4,000.
Wow. So you can see why this power to choose cases is so important.
Absolutely.
They can't possibly hear them all.
Okay, so they're choosing their cases very carefully. Now, what about arguably their most famous power? And the one that always seems to generate a lot of discussion and controversy?
It does.
And this power isn't even explicitly spelled out in the Constitution.
It isn't.
I'm talking about judicial review.
It's judicial review.
So what is judicial review?
So in a nutshell, judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to decide whether a law or an action by the president or Congress is constitutional or not.
Okay, so they can say, hey, Congress, you passed this law, but guess what? It violates the Constitution.
It's unconstitutional.
It's unconstitutional. We're striking it down.
Exactly.
It's same thing with the president.
Same with the president. Yeah, they can review executive orders.
Okay, so they're really acting as a check.
A big check.
On the other branches of government.
It's a fundamental part of that system.
Okay, so this power, like you said, it's not specifically written in the Constitution.
It's not there in black and white.
Where did it come from?
Well, it was established in the landmark case of Marbury v. Madison.
Marbury v. Madison, 1803.
1803, that's right.
One of those cases that everybody learns about.
Oh yeah, it's a foundational case.
In law school, right?
It's a cornerstone.
Okay, so what happened in that case?
Well, the court was faced with a tricky situation.
Okay.
You see, Congress had passed the Judiciary Act of 1789.
The one we talked about before.
The very same.
Yeah.
And this act gave the Supreme Court original jurisdiction to issue writs of mandamus.
Writs of mandamus, so...
It's basically a court order telling a government official to do their job.
Okay.
But the court looked at that part of the act and they said, hold on a second.
Yeah.
This actually expands our original jurisdiction beyond what Article 3 of the Constitution allows.
Okay, so there was a conflict?
There was a conflict,
between the law and the Constitution.
Right.
Okay.
And Chief Justice John Marshall, who's leading the court at the time, he wrote this brilliant opinion. And he said, Article 6 of the Constitution declares the Constitution to be the supreme law of the land.
Right, the top dog.
Top dog, the big cheese.
The rule book?
The rule book, exactly.
Okay.
So any law that goes against the Constitution is invalid.
Okay.
So based on that logic, the court said, we have the power to strike down laws that we find to be unconstitutional.
So they basically gave themselves this power.
Well, they sort of inferred it from the structure and logic of the Constitution.
Right. It's not written there explicitly.
Not explicitly.
But they're saying, look, this is the only way the system can really work.
That's right.
If we're going to have a constitution that is truly supreme, you have to have somebody who can enforce it.
Right. And who better than the judicial branch?
Right.
The branch that's supposed to be impartial, focused on the law.
Okay. And imagine if that wasn't the case, if Congress or the president could just act
with no check.
With no check on whether what they're doing is actually constitutional.
It would be chaos. Potentially.
It would be a totally different system.
A totally different system.
Okay, so Marbury v. Madison established this principle.
It really did.
Of judicial review. But it doesn't just apply to federal laws, does it?
No, it doesn't.
It also applies to state laws.
That's right. So over time, the Supreme Court has said we can also strike down state laws that violate the Constitution.
Okay, so if a state passes a law that the Supreme Court finds to be unconstitutional, it's gone.
It's gone, yeah. Okay. That's the power of judicial review.
Okay, and then there's also this issue of the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
So the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments to the Constitution, they guarantee all sorts of individual liberties.
Freedom of speech, freedom of religion.
Yeah, all the important ones.
Right to bear arms.
Yeah. But initially, those rights really only applied to the federal government, right?
That's right.
So the federal government couldn't violate your freedom of speech.
Right.
But a state could.
Potentially, yeah. So that changed after the Civil War.
Okay.
With the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868.
Okay.
The 14th Amendment is really important. Okay. It has a lot of different provisions.
Yeah.
But one of the key things it does is it says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
Okay.
So the Supreme Court has interpreted that to mean that most of the protections in the Bill of Rights also apply to the states.
Okay, so now states can't violate those rights either.
That's right.
Okay, so the Supreme Court has really expanded the scope of its own power.
They've played a big role in shaping how we understand the Constitution.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Supreme Court's power.
We have.
Now let's zoom out a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about their role, their impact on the American legal and political system as a whole.
Okay, good idea.
So what is their overall role?
Well, it's multifaceted. First and foremost, they're the court of last resort in the federal judiciary.
Okay, so if you've gone through all the lower courts and you still haven't gotten the result you want, the Supreme Court is potentially your last stop.
That's right.
Okay.
But beyond that, and I think this is even more important, they act as a check on the other branches of government.
Okay, so back to that idea.
Checks and balances. Checks and balances in action.
Okay.
So through judicial review, they make sure that Congress and the president are staying within the limits.
Constitutional limits.
Set by the Constitution.
Okay, and how does that work in practice?
So let's say Congress passes a law.
Okay.
The Supreme Court can review that law, and if they find that it violates the Constitution, they can strike it down.
They can say, nope, unconstitutional, you can't do that.
Exactly, and it's the same with the president. If the president issues an executive order, the court can review that. And if they find that it goes beyond the president's powers, or that it infringes on someone's constitutional rights, they can strike that down too.
Okay, so
it's a pretty powerful check.
Yeah, pretty powerful. Now, on the flip side, the other branches also have some checks on the Supreme Court there.
They do.
It's not like the court has absolute power.
No, it's a balance.
Yeah.
So, for example, the president nominates the justices.
Right.
And the Senate has to confirm them.
Right. So they have a say in who gets on the court.
Absolutely.
In the first place. Okay. And then Congress also has the power to impeach and remove judges.
That's right.
Including Supreme Court justices.
Yeah, for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors.
Okay, so there are some pretty serious consequences if a justice really acts improperly.
It's a high bar.
Yeah.
But it is there.
It is there. Okay, so it's a system where everyone is kind of keeping an eye on each other.
It's a system of mutual accountability.
Right.
It's designed to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful.
Okay, so beyond this idea of keeping the other branches in check, what other impacts does the Supreme Court have?
Well, I mean, their decisions have a huge impact on society as a whole.
Okay.
So, for example, they play a crucial role in protecting civil rights and liberties.
Okay.
They can strike down laws that discriminate against people. They can uphold laws that promote equality.
Yeah.
They also protect minority rights.
Okay.
They make sure that the majority can't just run roughshod over the rights of the minority.
So they're sort of balancing the will of the majority with the rights of individuals.
Exactly. And that's a delicate balance.
It is.
But it's a really important one.
Yeah.
And you know, their decisions also help to ensure that the Constitution remains relevant in a changing world.
Right, because the Constitution was written
centuries ago.
Centuries ago, and the world has changed a lot since then.
It has.
So how do they deal with that?
Well, they have to interpret the Constitution in light of modern circumstances.
Right.
So they're not just looking at the text.
Right.
They're also looking at the context.
Yeah.
The history.
Yeah.
The values that underlie the Constitution.
Yeah, so it's not just a static document.
No, it's a living document.
A living document.
It's a document that evolves with the times.
And I think, you know, one of the best examples of that